It is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Pam Allyn. Pam is a renowned literacy advocate and author. Her books include Best Books for Boys, the award-winning What to Read When, and Your Child's Writing Life. She is a national leader in the field of professional development and speaks globally on the learning lives of children and young adults. Pam is a Kellogg Foundation Fellow for Racial Equity and Healing. She received the Scholastic Literacy Champion Award in 2013 and is the Scholastic Open a World of Possible Ambassador for 2015. Pam created Lit World to serve the nation and the world's children as readers and created the widely celebrated World Read Aloud Day. Her forthcoming book, which I will be purchasing when it becomes available for sure, is co-authored with Ernest Morel, and it's called Every Child is a Super Reader. I bring to you Pam Allyn.
Thank you for being here, and I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts about parenting and grandparenting around reading, because it is such a special part of what we are doing with our children, such an important and valuable part of the work that we do and the lifelong work that we do. So I was telling some of the teachers and leaders here that both our daughters just recently came back to New York City where we live, and they're like in the city with us in their own respective apartments. But when we go, you know, they've been away at college and doing different things, and now they're back in the city and living their independent lives. And when we go to cross the busy streets of New York, I immediately, instinctively reach for their hands. You know, I'm immediately back, I'm like clutching, because it's that feeling. And yesterday, on the plane coming here, there was a father with his little boy in the seat beside him, and the little boy was about 3, and he was just very active and feisty, and he was talking the entire ride. He had a running commentary, and his dad kept saying, Weston, Weston, settle down, the whole entire flight. And then when they got close, Weston like poked his head up and peeked over the window and said, Dad, Dad. And of course, at this point, the father was like sound asleep. And he cricks open one eye, and he says, what is it, Wes? And Wes says, Dad, are those lights Boston? And I thought, this guy is like on a 24-hour Weston duty. You know what I mean? Like, he's got to answer, he's got to be ready. He's got to answer a lot of crucial questions, you know? So I was a little worried, because as I was watching this unfold, we were about to start landing, and I thought, when the father his eyes were closed, Weston had cleverly unbuckled his seatbelt and was like doing his peeking over the window to see the twinkling lights of Boston. And I thought to myself, that dad better like really open his eyes wide, because this kid has now lost his seatbelt. And as the plane landed, like West kind of levitated in the air, you know what I mean? He was like literally airborne. And I see the father just sort of pulling back down to the seat. Now, he is used to this, you know? This is like West's life, you know? And I went down to meet my husband at the baggage claim, and I see this kid like tearing off, you know? So it's just everybody, every child is so unique and so precious and so different. And the sort of big ideas about reading and how reading happens and how we learn to read, there are some very predictable ways that children learn to read, just the way children learn to walk, and children learn to talk, and children learn to write. And so those things oftentimes are extremely actually predictable, even from language to language and country to country. There are some real consistencies around how that happens. But at the same time, it's West. You know what I mean? Nobody's like him. Nobody's like my Charlotte crossing the street, even as a 21-year-old. I want to clutch her and say, I hope you're safe. And so, you know, that idea of the uniqueness of the child and also the universality of literacy is both what makes learning to read so extraordinary and so profound, and also what makes it quite complicated, too. It's a very hard thing. And the process of reading is so different from really anything else, because it's an ongoing, iterative process. You don't learn to read one day and then you're done. I actually think I'm a better reader now than I was 10 years ago. I think I've improved as a reader, even though I thought I was pretty good 10 years ago, I'm reading differently now. I'm reading more deeply now. I can really understand things and make connections in a way that I don't think I could have done 10 years ago. So when you think about a 5-year-old and how much more learning they have to do and how much more they have to go, West is just at the beginning of his journey. And then again, he's also West, you know what I mean? So you have so many factors going into that journey that your child takes as a reader. That journey is just beginning. And that journey continues for the whole of their lives, all the way well into their adulthood. So we're really here to accompany our children, whether you're a teacher or a parent or a grandparent or a caregiver. Our job is really about accompaniment. And when I'm going to share with you some of my tips tonight about what that means for me and my perspective as a reading educator, what I see works across the board in every home for every child, whether it's Weston or Charlotte or another child in your home. But there's also that particular rare snowflake that is your child, that nobody else can quite understand in the way that you do of your own child and your own child's heart and your own child's life. And the beautiful thing about literacy is two things. One is that literacy itself is an innovation. It really is humankind's greatest innovation. We talk a lot about technology as innovation. When you hear the word innovation, you always think it's technology. Immediately you think an Apple computer. That's like our equals an Apple computer. But actually, the sign of true innovation is flexibility. And literacy started as people around the campfire telling stories, because that's literacy. That's speaking and listening. People started drawing on walls. That's literacy. People started telling stories by writing them down in beautiful calligraphy. That's literacy. People started making printing presses and making reading cheaper for more people. That was literacy. People started to realize they could bind books and sell them in the streets. That's literacy. And then more recently, people realized you could actually text message someone and communicate a big idea, and that's literacy. So while everything continues to change, literacy continues to evolve, and it never becomes unnecessary. And at every generation, we say things like, oh my God, reading is dead. Don't we always do, oh my God, there won't be any more books. You know, we get really shocked. And the truth of the matter is that just never happens. It's such a good idea that nobody wants it to end. And so it just continues and takes on different forms. And maybe, as we were talking before, somebody, you know, we were joking that someday reading will just be like, where you like look through your eyeball, or you make a thumbprint special in the air. Who knows what it will look like? But it's not going to go away, because it's really the essence of humanity. It's what we all want to do. We want to communicate with each other. We want to be near to each other. We want to understand each other. And that's really what your child wants. When your child wants you to read Goodnight Moon again and again and yet again, that book is deceptively simple. But what Margaret Wise Brown understood is the deepest hungers and fears and worries of childhood. So she built an entire world around that. This idea of separation of the child going to sleep, the bunny going to sleep, and then the bunny not wanting to say goodnight, or not wanting to say goodbye, not wanting to separate day to night, aloneness from companionship. And that's exactly what reading is. It's a way of not being alone. It's actually what I call the mirrors and the windows of our lives. You can look through the text and you can see the mirror of yourself. You can look through the text and see a window into a world you want to go to. The challenge with readers, especially as they get older, if it doesn't feel like that from the beginning, they become alienated from it. They think it's all about the marks on the page. They think it's, if I don't get through to that last line, I'm not going to do well. If I don't get to the end of the page and I don't do well, that's going to feel bad for me. And so reading becomes associated with negative feeling, and a feeling of, I didn't belong to that club. That's not a club I felt good about. And so a lot of my work has been working with older children, older boys and girls, who have not really been invited to the literacy club, and to really try to figure out, for myself and for my work, what we could do both now for that 15-year-old who had never felt included, and also to go back and say what was missing at the beginning that we can be certain that we say belongs to every child. So with that, I want to ask you if you could, I know not everybody is sitting close by to each other, but if you can even find somebody to talk to, I would love for you to take just 2 minutes or 3 minutes to both introduce yourself to someone nearby if you don't know them, and then to share what is a wondering that you came here with tonight. So I can do 2 things. I'm going to share with you my best practices as a parent and an educator, and then I'm going to try to weave in some of your wonderings so I can make sure that you go away with the kinds of wonderings resolved, or at least beginning to be resolved, that you came here with. So take a minute, if you could, to introduce yourself to someone and to share or listen to someone else's wondering. Take a few minutes to turn and talk. So let's maybe just to share out some of your wonderings so that I can weave them in to my presentation, and I'll give us a chance to kind of reflect as we go through together so that we can have, it's a formal setting, but I'm an informal person, so we can have opportunity to ask questions or to put more questions out as we're together this evening. But let's just take a minute, if we could, and to feel comfortable here, I invite you to wonder, because it is a deep and rich journey, as I said, and it is one of those things, the child and the parent, the child and the grandparent, that is an evolving, constantly changing, and the most amazing thing that I think about parenting is how forgiving our children are. You know, if anything I say here tonight, you say, my God, I didn't do that. You can always do it like tomorrow. You know what I mean? Even if your kid is 18, you can still do that. So, yeah, that's how I feel. So let's, wonderings. Yes?
Our daughter much prefers us to read to her than for her to read the book. And if we read it simply one time, she somehow writes it to memory and can then recite it.
How old is she?
6 months.
Wow. Okay, that's great. But I'm going to incorporate all of that in. What else? Yes?
So my daughter also 5 and a half. I was at the luck of sitting almost next to your cousin. And I think I found the ways to have her physically motivated to read. And she loves doing that every night, in fact. And she asked me to read. And I found the topics that she likes based on her personality and all that. But I want to just make sure that that nurturing of that also really continues going on, because I love different stages on her age will change behaviors and will change everything that I just want to be prepared for that, so that I can steer things in the right way for her to kind of provide an environment that is right.
How old is she?
It's 5 and a half.
Okay, thank you. What else? Yes?
My 9-year-old boy likes books, but if I ask if he go to library and he only pick the graphic books. But if I want him to read chapter books, he likes me reading to him, and also I sometimes borrow the audiobook for him. I don't know if that's a good way to introduce books to him.
Thank you.
I have an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, and both of the parents in my home work, and the kids are exhausted. We're all exhausted at bedtime. So even though I grew up with the bedtime ritual of reading, and we try to do that as much as possible, sometimes we're all just too exhausted.
Yeah.
And so I'm really curious about how to create routines and rituals in my life during the day, on a weekend, or even in the morning.
Yeah.
Just smaller pockets of time of, this is reading time, but it's drop everything in the middle of a crazy day and make it happen.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, of course.
so as part of the reading routine, I sometimes notice that when she has some fluency in reading, she started to have some fluency in reading, like Henry and Mudge and those interesting books. But sometimes there are words that she might not know how to read, but I know sometimes that she can, So I just trying to find a balance between, waiting for her to try it out versus me, reading it.
Yes.
So where is that, and what is better for her to really understand what she's reading, as opposed to, decoding, the word and
Yes.
keeping the intrinsic motivation in place.
It is complex. Yes.
Hi, I'm a single mom and I work full-time, so I understand the exhaustion. My question or concern rather would be to find the tools that I can implement at home to keep my daughter interested in learning to read when she's away at her father's. It's obviously it's an acrimonious relationship, but just to keep her interest peaked so that I'm not always having to harp on her, that I feel like the nagging parent to try and get her to read, because it's not reinforced when she's away.
Thank you.
I'm thinking I might have the opposite problem that you have. When my daughter was younger, she likes us to read it to her. But now she's older, she can write, she can read normal books. And usually she doesn't want us to read to her, But I thought it was some extra things that we could actually do and read to her. So I wonder whether it's just a good way to encourage her to allow us to read to her. Thanks.
Thank you. One more?
Hi, my son is a sixth grader and he's 11 years old. So he likes to read when he was very young, and also, like other families, when we as parents exhausted, we, introduced audiobook to him. I'm wondering, can audiobook replace, parents, child read aloud? And also, since he is getting older and he's reading, longer books, I find it hard to read aloud with him anymore, because oftentimes it's the book he reads is a few hundred pages. Another question is, it looks like, he only likes very specific books, like cartoon books, and also, like the book like Time Machines, this kind of books. And there are a lot of more books I like him to read, but he doesn't seem to be interested. So we borrowed a bunch of books from the library, and by the end of the time, most of the books are still unread, and he just said, I'm not interested. So I'm just wondering how to get him interested in a wider array of books.
Great. Also, these are all amazingly great and important questions, and so I thank you for sharing them. I'm going to weave them in. There are some common themes here that will help me to be as targeted as possible when I'm sharing with you too. Reading, contrary to what you kind of see on TV or when people are reading in movies or things like that, always seems to be very solitary. But actually, everything you've described has to do with reading as a social community, and reading as an interaction or an engagement with you, with the book, with a friend, with the community, with the family, All of that is really important to the child. What place does reading have in this social community? So let's keep that in mind as I share with you an acronym. I said 5 ways, and I'm going to use the acronym READ, R-E-A-D, plus one special one at the end to make it 5, to help us to really think about what structures that we can put around some of these challenges that we all face as parents. We think about book choice, we think about the role and the timing around reading in our lives, the continuation or the consistency of reading, what is that our child doing as a reader. So I want to share with you, when you think about there's some amazing thing that I just read yesterday, that for the first time in American history, the children's books have exceeded the sales of adult books in the United States. For the first time this year, 2014, the sales of children's books, and not only that, the sales increased by something like 30%. So what does that say? Well, it says we have a problem. You know what I mean? But the second thing is, and I want you to keep this in mind, is that there are so many books being published right now for children that weren't around when we were growing up. And so in a way, I think that confuses us a little bit. I can't tell you how many parents have approached me to say, my kid just does not want to read Little House on the Prairie, even though I loved that series. I just loved it. And my daughter says to me, that has to be the most boring book I have ever read in my life. All they do every day is either A, try to not be cold, or B, make some basket that takes 10 pages to get finished. So not to say, and I'm really not bashing because I love Little House on the Prairie, but at the same time, just to keep in mind that the world that our children are reading in is a different world from the world we grew up in. And you know what? It might not be so bad. You know what I'm saying? So that's just something to think about. When you think about a series like Harry Potter, which didn't exist when we were growing up, and is now in the world as a modern classic, that is an extraordinary thing. A new classic was born in our lifetimes. That's amazing. But it's also, these books are different. They're different from many of the books we read as children were much more moralistic in a certain way than humanistic. They were kind of teaching us something. Even when you think about The Little House on the Prairie or Little Women, any of the books I read as a child, it was kind of teaching us how to behave on a certain level, especially girls. It's be a good girl or not a good girl, but that was a lot of the messaging that was going on. Whereas Hermione in the Harry Potter series is smarter than most of the boys and completely capable of almost everything. And so there's good things about the evolution of reading, just like I said earlier about the evolution of literacy. So this idea, my thesis is really that every child can be and should be and will be a super reader. But it's part of the challenge of it is that reading itself, the super reader in the world, is a reader who has challenge and faces that challenge feeling pretty good about it. And so even in that read aloud, or that sort of where that journey is taking her or him, the 9-year-old, the 5-year-old, your twins, all of our children are at some point in the day facing some measure of struggle as readers. Now, I was with a little boy the other day who was 10 years old, and he belongs to a rock climbing club. And he was telling me that he's learning now how to climb rocks without those little handles in the rocks. He's just learning how to climb on the rock itself. And I said, what does your rock coach do to help you learn to do that? And he said to me, well, she just has us do this. And I said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? And he said, I mean, we do that a lot. We have to practice that when we go home, and we have to practice that before we go to sleep, and we have to practice that stretching our fingers every single day. And I thought, the thing about exertion or energy or putting yourself to the focus is sometimes it's going to be repetitious, sometimes it's going to be full of kind of challenges and unexpected pitfalls, and sometimes it's going to be just pure joy when you find your way up that tough rock. And that's really what reading is all about. But the thing I want to say about this is, and many of you mentioned this sort of worry around the book choice, and I'm going to talk about that. That idea of, oh my gosh, my kid is reading only graphic books, or my kid is reading only joke and riddle books, or my kid does not want to read the books that I really think maybe would be really good for him or her to read. What I want to say about that is there is so much that your child is doing as a reader to flex those reading muscles, like my little guy Sam was flexing his hands as a rock climber. There's so much that they're doing that's not visible to the human eye. So a child who's rereading or practicing or even reciting is practicing not only the content of the book, but also building stamina building fluency and building comprehension. So every time your child wants to reread, that's not because they're lazy or because they just don't like it or because they feel like that's just easier. It's because they're actually working on something. And that's exactly when Sam said, like, I just do this all the time. And he was so proud of it. And I thought we, as parents, one of the things we can do is really advocate for and champion that those invisible things that our children are doing as readers that make them strong. And so some of that's, like, we focus all of our attention on the titles. Like we say, my kid read Harry Potter, why is he reading it again? And in truth, what's happening is the child is doing some very deep work around rereading, which is really important to that child and also to the development. It's not just about what is this book about, but it's how fast can I read this? It's about how much do I remember when I read this? It's about all that vocabulary that's being marinated inside of me as I read this. When my daughter was 9, the Harry Potter series came out, and she read the first one about 10 times, and the second one hadn't come out yet. And then we happened to go to London right before the second book came out, and we were walking by a bookstore, and she saw the original Harry Potter, the Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, which is the same book as Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. It's just the British original version. For some reason, I guess they thought Americans wouldn't know what the word philosopher was. I don't know why they changed that title. But anyway, so when she saw that book in the window, she was like trembling. And she said, there's the second book. And we said, no, Charlotte, that's actually the first book in the original edition. And she said, I need that book right now. And so we said, but you have the book, like that's the same book. And our older daughter stepped in so wisely and said, Mom, get her that book. So we went in and we got that book, and while everyone else was visiting Big Ben and the cathedrals and this and that and the other, she had her head in that book for like 10 straight days and could write like a master's thesis on Harry Potter. She found like every small place where the British lingo was different from the American lingo, and it didn't faze her at all that actually it wasn't much different from the one that she had been reading in the United States. Now, why I tell that story is because she was doing the work of a reader. She was going deeper in every reading. She was going deeper into the characters, analyzing the relationships between Harry and Hermione and Ron and Hagrid, and she was doing the deeper work, and it became deeper and deeper each time she reread that text. When you think about why reading does matter, why that experience matters, why that read aloud matters, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, and why I actually also agree with you, by the way, about the bedtime ritual. I think that is I love it because it's very cozy. I also don't love it because I tell you how many times I fell asleep in my daughter's bed reading the book that she had chosen for the 50th time that, could have just put you to sleep right after 2 sentences. But I also think like you would never have your child practice if they're playing violin. Your violin teacher would never say the only time you practice or listen to music together is right before bed when you're completely frazzled, you did not clean the kitchen dishes, and now you're going to go practice the violin. We only say that about reading. And so that idea about ritual, moving it around in the day, to me is really extremely important because reading is so big. It's about really talking through the things we value together. It's about how we fall in love with language. It's about how we build comprehension, like Charlotte was doing, going deeper into Harry Potter. It was about how we learned the power of story, what story means in our lives. It was about how we expose our children to a variety of genres, so it's not just fiction, it's also nonfiction, it's poetry, it's magazines, it's blogs, it's online reading and offline reading. It's how we learn about classic structures of text. The child who reads now Harry Potter is reading, when that child reads Shakespeare in high school, that's a very similar text structure. It's the hero's journey. It's a very familiar archetype for that child when they get to be older and they're reading Hamlet. They can say, or they're reading the Odyssey. They can say, hey, you know what, Odysseus reminds me a lot, actually, of Harry Potter. And that our children find comfort in reading, that the rereading of Goodnight Moon and the rereading of text, the recitation of text is not just about I'm learning to read, it's about reading to learn the world, and it's about reading to be comforted, to find comfort in the world. Now the standards, the Common Core standards, are really promoting this idea of critical thinking skills, open-ended questions, which I'll talk about in a minute. This idea that our children are able to interpret text, that it's not just your idea or the teacher's idea, it's not even just the author's idea, but it's the child's relationship to that text. And that's where I'll go back to some of your questions about both how do I get my child to continue reading aloud with me, and then conversely, how do we move our child to more independent practice? And this idea of this reading identity that's changing all the time. Hey, you say to your child, you're the kind of reader who loves soccer. You're the kind of reader who loves to reread. Hey, you're the kind of reader who likes pictures in your books. What kind of reader do you describe yourself as? Now, the interesting thing, and there's an article that's coming out Sunday in the New York Times Magazine that you should not miss, but it's about an author who talks about how the big problem for her as a parent right now is that everything she's reading, her children can't see her reading. So she was at a soccer game with her children were playing, and she was reading a book of poetry on her phone. And the woman next to her said, "Look at us. All the parents just on our phones. You know, it's so bad, really, for the kids to see that." And this author was all upset because she wanted to show them, "Look, I'm reading poetry, I swear." But nobody could see or tell. And she said at home her children get very frustrated with her because she always seems to be on her phone. When in fact she's checking grocery lists, she's writing an email to someone, she's reading a novel, she's writing a novel, but they can't tell. And so the identity of the adult reader is more secret than it's ever been, and that's actually a problem. So we have to talk about our own reading identity too. I'm the kind of reader who likes to read People magazine when I'm tired. That's something that my kids, when they were little, they saw me do that. Maybe I was reading like Anna Karenina when I was all perky, but when I'm like 10 o'clock at night, I can tell you right now, I'm not reading that. I'm reading like, about the Kardashians or something. But now, with the phones and the tablets, our kids can't even see who we are as readers, much less us see who they are as readers. So we have to be more open and more visible about our reading lives. And that idea that I said earlier about this idea of visiting the worlds, that when we accompany our children, we can talk about how we enter those worlds together. So what are the 5 ways? And I'm gonna share those with you right now. Tricky. Number 1, and my acronym, remember, is READ, R-E-A-D. So R is for ritual. And you touched on this earlier when you talked about this read aloud. The tradition of the read aloud is bedtime. That's when you read. But for many of our children, even that idea of what they choose to read before they go to sleep is also conditional on their own identity too. My daughter always kept Mrs. Pigglewiggle right by her bed, even through high school. And she said to me, I've read 1,000 other things, but every now and then you just need a little bit of Mrs. Pigglewiggle. And that's true for all of us. We all need that comfort book, and sometimes right before bed is exactly the time you need it. So what is it that we can do to build ritual? One is the read aloud every day. And the read aloud not always being the picture book or the chapter book, but the read aloud being the news, being the joke, being the sports pages. My father was from Cleveland, and he loved sports, especially sports from Ohio. And he would always read to me from the sports section of the paper. That read aloud really went deep into me. That read aloud became part of who I became as a person, even as an adult. Some of the best writing is sports writers' writing. It's a beautiful writing. If you saw Yogi Berra just died, and there were so many sports writers wrote about him, it was beautiful. My dad passed away this year, but we all wrote to each other and said, all the cousins and my daughters, and we all said that Papa would have loved those articles. He would have been reading them to all of us. So it's not just about that chapter book read aloud, but it's what are the other things we can find for our kids that they can read aloud, that we can read aloud to them. Now, why do I say this is important? Because the research shows that reading aloud is critical to our child's lifelong reading success. This study came out last year that said daily reading aloud to children puts them almost a year ahead in school academically of children who do not receive daily read-alouds. That is amazing. That study just came out, right? And that study in the midst of our technology revolution saying, don't forget the read-aloud, but never saying it has to be done at 9 p.m. or 8 p.m. Scholastic just recently came out with a study that said all age groups say they love or like being read aloud to at home. New research that just came out said reading aloud to children is more effective for building vocabulary than talking to children. Now, that literary language, this study is saying from the University of California, Santa Cruz, is saying the best way to help children develop word mastery and grammatical understanding is to read aloud. They're not saying what to read aloud. They're not saying it has to be Little House on the Prairie by any stretch. They're saying really any text that we read aloud is marinating language in our children. So it's that important. And then how we bring those texts alive to our children, with our children, for our children. Taking the text away from the bedtime, into the day, into the Saturday morning, into the Monday afternoon, into the bath time, into the kitchen time, into all the times around us where we can say, what are we doing with the text? What are we doing to take the text away from the page? To make the text part of what we put on the refrigerator, what we send to our grandmother, what we take a picture of and post on Facebook. And also that there are so many great ways for us to return reading aloud to the online experience. So there's a great new website called ereaderstheater.com. And for kids who aren't your traditional readers, who do love that oral connection, a website like this one is amazing. This Readers Theater is short plays and scripts that you can read with your child. Your child can take turns with you to read aloud together at home. Number 2, E for environment. What happens in the environment? I want to talk about that child who's going between 2 environments. The child who's going from the mother's home to the father's home. And what I want to say to you is, a reading environment doesn't have to be static. It can be very portable. But the child has to feel like the child owns that environment. So to create personalized baskets, not bookshelves, because bookshelves become very static, but baskets and bags, for example, that your child can create an independent reading book bag, an independent reading library at home, where your child can see baskets, can see boxes that can change and continue to change. Also that we can face books out rather than putting them into that kind of binder where it's very hard for a small child to look at just the binding of a book, but to have all those great librarian strategies and techniques, the portability and mobility of a home library, where my daughters are saying to themselves, who am I as a reader, that identity piece, and then how am I changing? That the bookshelf and what that child takes to her dad's house should change. Once a week, let's go book shopping. And we can do that right in our own home. Let's go to the library, let's go online, let's go book shopping and make sure that your personalized basket, your personalized bag has you in it. Because you're changing as a reader every single day. So that you're really paying attention to the child who used to love to read about frogs and now loves to read about spiders. Or the child who used to love to read only fiction and now really is beginning to try poetry. Because maybe that child's teacher, someone in that child's world, has opened that child up to that world of possible. That we can open those physical and mental spaces in our children designed to build an independent reading life. So that, again, reading accompanies her wherever she goes. From mom's house to dad's house, from my house to grandma's house. All around that child goes with the bag on her back, the iPad in her hand, the basket cradled between her and her brother in the back seat of the car, that basket, that bag, that iPad is changing all the time because the reading identity is always changing. And that the child is always practicing. Because like my little guy Sam with his flexing his fingers, that's exactly what a child is doing in building a reading life. The child is tying his shoes, he's zipping his jacket, he's doing all these wonderful things that make him become a reader. He's becoming stronger every day by practicing. And the environment is the key. The environment is the key. I want my kids to stumble over books. I want them to find them in the bathroom. I want them to find them in the kitchen. I want them to find them on their cell phones. I want to find them everywhere they go. Joke books in the bathroom. I want them to find nonfiction, food-type books in the kitchen. I want them to find really fun, interesting books on their Kindle, online. I want them to live in a blended world. Why? Because many, many children's books are not digitized. They're almost so beautiful that the digitization just has not caught up with their beauty. And so rather than say my kids do all their reading online, we have to create home-blended libraries to represent this idea that I practice, like the soccer. Like if you have soccer balls, like I know for our younger daughter played field hockey, and she had her sticks, like anything became a hockey puck. Like wherever she went, that ball, the girls' field hockey ball, everywhere she went, like she brought her stick. And she was always like a stone, a pebble, a shell, anything she had, she would always be swatting around with a stick. That's what we want our kids to do with books. Wherever they stumble upon them, they will find them. But choice is key. Scholastic came out with this study this year that said 91% of children say their favorite books are the ones they picked out. So how can we make choice matter? We have to have abundance. The environment has to be changing, abundant, and full of, back to many questions that came up. The child that wants only to read the graphic book. The child that won't read that book that was a favorite of mine when I was growing up. When my kids were like 15, I said, oh, you have to read this book. I loved it. It was called Marjorie Morningstar. Anybody remember this book? Anyway, I insisted, and both my girls started, they were like, this is the worst book we have ever read in our lives. So I picked it up, and I was like in a whole affront, because I was telling them how it changed me, and it was like revolutionary, and I started reading, and I said, this is awful. You know, it's just it's so dumb. I don't know how I loved it so much. But like I said earlier about Little House on the Prairie, not to insult these books, but there weren't as many books then. Like there is just a whole industry now that didn't exist then. And the graphic novels, from adult graphic novels to child novels, are actually, many of them are brilliant. Not every one of them, just like not every adult novel is brilliant either, but we're reading them also for different reasons. We're reading them to build stamina, like I said, we're reading them to build comprehension. We're reading them, as I said earlier, to be part of the social community of reading. Everybody's reading Captain Underpants, so I want to read it. Everybody's reading, like right now in my community, everybody's reading a graphic memoir called Fun Home. Everybody's reading it, so I want to read it. It just came to Broadway, and so everybody in New York is going to see it. Everybody's reading Fun Home. It's a graphic memoir. It has many, many pictures in it. Everybody wants to read it. That's being part of a social community, and when your child brings home the graphic novel, you can be certain that in school and after school, they're seeing a social community around reading around those books. And so it's important that they be able to do that. And that idea of browsing and rereading, it's so crucial that they are invited to return and revisit to text because of that hard work that they continue to do. So I'm going to ask you again, if you could, to take a minute to reflect. What new wonderings are bubbling up? And then I'm going to share with you the final, how many did we do? 2. So I'm going to share with you my three more tips, and I'll weave more of your wonderings in. So take a minute to find someone you didn't talk to just a few minutes ago, and take a minute again to turn and talk. Are there wonderings that are coming to you now that you want to make sure that I touch on? Yeah.
Video winning out over reading.
Okay, that's a big one. I'm going to talk about that. In fact, I'll weave that into this one right here. Video winning out. Yeah.
How to encourage early readers to try out reading out loud. Like not being, and getting the confidence to try it. Like,
I guess just building on that, how to get them through the frustration.
Yep,
That's big.
that's big. Reading has, as I said earlier, you know, that rock climbing metaphor, reading has a lot of hard parts. And one of the things is our kids, I think this is a plus and a minus, our kids think we're like amazing. They think you are amazing. Like even if you don't always know that, they really, you are like a superstar to them. So they don't really know that we struggle. And that's another really interesting thing about reading is it's hard to see people do it. So you don't really know what anybody's doing when they're decoding or cutting through a hard part or something they don't understand. It's not like math where you could actually put a problem up and actually watch as someone solves it. It is a little bit more difficult to see someone solving a reading problem. So that, in and of itself, is an area where we can make more visible reading difficulty. When I get to a hard part, this is what I do. The other day, my nephew, who's in college, is really struggling at the beginning of the year. He took a year off from high school to college, and now he's really having a hard time keeping up with his papers. So I said, Benno, let's get on a Google Doc, and we'll walk with you through what I do when I take notes. And so I bought the book on my Kindle that he's reading. I'm like doing very well in this class now. I bought the book on my Kindle, and then he had the book, and he's in North Carolina at a college down there. And on the Google Doc, where you could actually watch each other writing, I took notes, so he could watch me take notes. And I said, the problem is you can't see me reading, but I'm skipping a lot of parts. Like I'm looking at the bold part, and then I'm skipping over to the next bold part, because we had to get through 158 pages in 2 days, so don't judge me. You know what I mean? So I said, you know, listen, this is what readers do. Like if we've got to get something done, I have some really good techniques for how I have to get through this fast. And he said, Aunt Pam, isn't this like cheating? And I said, excuse me, my boy, step back. You know what I mean? But I said, no, that's the thing. What was so interesting to me is how he really didn't know that's how people do that. That was like a mysterious thing to him. Maybe people have taught him how to take notes, but no one ever taught him how to take notes under pressure. Or even how to take notes efficiently, which is also what I was doing, right? As I was reading, I had a strategy for getting myself through the hard parts, which included skipping some of the hard parts, but that's also a strategy in and of itself. And when one of my daughters was reading, remember the Twilight series? She was kind of like on the cusp of, well, you know that kind of book where you're like, is she too young to be reading? You know that when you're like, is this okay? You know how that is? And that's also, by the way, a big question that parents often have for me is, how do I know when that's the right age? I'll tell you, my rule of thumb is I implicitly trust anybody under the age of 15. Like, I just trust them completely. If they think something's too hard or they want to reread a book, I trust them. Over the age of 16, you're kind of like I'm questioning you a little bit more. But when my daughters were reading Twilight, I said to them, listen, I'm with you in this. Your friends are reading these books, but if you get to a part that feels uncomfortable, and they were like, yeah, there are a couple of uncomfortable things, but we want to read this book. I said, skip it. Just like close your eyes and like go quickly past those pages. And you know what? It's a great technique. You know what I mean? That gets me to the question about video. I actually, there was a moment in my life as a professional educator where I was really, and Ben, from Scholastic, you might remember this about me because he's known me a long time, but where I was like, the world is all moving ed tech and it's all about technology, we got to go with it. And as these years have passed, I'll tell you something, I actually think it is important for us to create a sanctity around the reading experience that is not actually about video. Because I think this generation we're raising now is like we're experimenting with them. Like we don't actually know if that's a good thing or not. So until we're certain, I think we owe it to our kids to be in a blended world. To actually really say to our children, I struggle with this because I value reading, and I also know how captivating movies and video are. So I want us to create the kind of home where matter. So for example, like I love television. I love it. I love those series like Grey's Anatomy and Friday Night Lights. I mean, it's like reading a novel. I mean, those are amazing shows. But I can't say to myself ever that I could do that and not read, but I can do that and read. But what's happening with our kids is for us just to simply say, well, the world is going to be technology anyway, so we might as well just let it go. That's really not that, that's not really that, we're not even certain that's true. So while we're in this blended world, it's like about 5 years ago, we all said handwriting was dead. Remember? We're like, nobody writes by hand. So about a year and a half ago, Bic, you know the pen company? They approached me and said, can you go on the road and talk to the media about handwriting? And I said, are you like asking me to be like the handwriting ambassador? And they were like, that's exactly right. So I was invited to the Bic headquarters, and you know, they have a whole chandelier at the Bic headquarters made it from pens. It's like a working chandelier. It's crazy there. It's like Pen City. You don't even know, it's like a whole world of pens. And they have this huge pen that's like a real working pen that's gigantic. It's like 6 feet tall. And it's just an amazing obsession with pens. And the thing is, at the beginning I said to myself, well, how do I feel about this? Like, do I care? And then I was cleaning out, we were moving, and I was cleaning out some closet, and I opened a box. And I found all these letters from my grandmother to me. And I sat there and I simply sobbed for about 2 hours, the longing and missing her for that. Her handwriting, which I will never see again. Similar, my dad just passed away. He had the best, most crazy, most difficult to read handwriting. And he would send me these little notes, in case you missed this. So on the day of Yogi Berra's obituary, no, I'm not going to get that handwriting anymore. Right? So that's not there anymore. And I think to myself, handwriting for children is like a signature. And it's the same with reading. It's so personal. We can't say that video replaces reading because we all read. And so the problem, though, is the access is the issue. Our kids can get video anywhere. They can get visual images everywhere. The problem is, unlike with the Twilight series, it's a lot harder to say to someone, just skip that when you're watching video, you're watching a movie. It's so much more out of your control. Reading, I say to my children, is much more in your control. And the reading that you do is reading that you do what I call uphill reading, level reading, and downhill reading. And that's actually really good language for you as parents to use with your kids. Uphill, level, downhill. Uphill feels like what you were talking about, that idea of it's kind of hard. But it doesn't mean you don't want to ride your bike uphill. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean it's hard, so therefore I don't do it. It's hard because I know what that feels like to pedal and change the gear and pedal some more. Those level books feel like when you're riding a bike on level ground. It feels nice. It might not be always as interesting as the uphill book, though. It might even not be as super fun as the downhill book. And the downhill book is maybe that graphic novel, maybe not. Maybe that graphic novel like Fun Home is really actually quite difficult to understand. And I suggest you read it, it's an amazing book. But when I talk about access, I'm also talking about online reading, what we can do to counter the video movement with some interest of our own as readers, as a reading movement, as a reading community online. Everything from the app and website Storia, which gives our children a lively version of online text, to other online sites like We Give Books, Storyline Online, Comics and Books. Wonderopolis is also another great site that your kids can look at online. Scholastic News Kids, Time Edge, News-O-Matic. All of these things are really great for your kids to read online. And they have a combination, a blended combination of video, audio, and print. So your children can feel like readers in the world, but also feel like they're part of that visual literacy movement. I'm not saying either or. I'm not saying I write only by hand, and then I go to and then I never use my tablet. I'm saying I am a writer in a blended world. I am a reader in a blended world. Because the truth is, like social networking, all the things that we use in the modern day, whether it's Instagram or YouTube or Foursquare or Twitter or Facebook, it's just like the same ideas that we always had. It's just in different form. So we don't have any idea what the form is going to be for our 5-year-olds and our 9-year-olds in another 5 years. But we do know that literacy still matters. Other sites that I really like that can counter that video movement in a certain way are kid blogs, like kidblog.com. Toontastic is another really great site for your kids, where your kids can read and create comics online. All of these types of online reading experiences give our kids the sensation that reading is crossing all boundaries. That you don't have to say, put down your video or your phone or your tablet so that you can start reading, but that reading exists in all these spaces. And these spaces are amazing and fun. Number 4, D is for dialogue. Now, somebody asked me the question, how do I get my very young child to read aloud at the very beginning of her reading experience? So one thing I want to say about that is I want to really value the sound of our voices together in this reading experience. My earliest memory is the sound of my mother reading aloud to me. So when I talk about that ritual read aloud, I'm talking about your voice. But when you talk about, and when we talk about our children's voices, I value those voices too as they're practicing the sound of their own reading voices in the world. There are books called Spot by Eric Hill. How many of you know these books? Spot. These books, this guy is a genius. I don't even know he didn't really write much in these books. But this man knew how to do it. Also, the Biscuit books. How many of you know the Biscuit books? Again, Alyssa Capicilli, genius. She was my neighbor. My kids growing up knew her and her children very, very well. And, used to come home and say to us, I think Alyssa thought of another Biscuit book today when we were having a play date. And I thought, it's not that difficult because Biscuit just does everything. This guy is doing every holiday. He's so busy and active. But what's so great about those early readers is they're so predictable. That's their beauty. And so the child learning to read and hearing the sound of their own reading voice, whether through Spot, through Frog and Toad, through the Biscuit books, is perhaps reading through the picture, but also through the very repetitive sound of repetitive text. That is actually how they can practice the sound of their voice. Spot. Sit Spot, go Spot, and you hear the intonation, they're starting their literary journey just by the sound of your voice and mirroring your voice. So my best advice for the child just learning to express her own reading voice is to reread those familiar books. Reread them and invite our children to reread through the sound of your voice. Dialogue is key. How we're talking about books, how we're wondering about books, how we're opening dialogue that doesn't have to do with what we know, that we're imparting knowledge to them, because the world isn't like that. If I want knowledge, I can go to Google. I can find out what everybody, including Einstein, thinks about almost everything. I don't need you to be my only voice as a parent. But what I can do is I can ask open-ended questions of my children. I can change the course of my child's reading life. When my child goes away from me on that journey away from me that might feel poignant, I can say to my child, I'm going to have my voice in your head as you go away from me. So I'm going to say, I'm going to see you in 2 days' time. What will you be wondering about as a reader? I can't wait to know. So I may ask questions like, what are your biggest questions about what we're reading? Not who is the main character, but what are your biggest questions? What does this story remind you of in your own life? Finding more and more out about the child you think you know so well, but who's having 6 hours a day in school without you. How could reading this book change you or your thinking in some way? How could reading Goodnight Moon or Charlotte's Web or Harry Potter or Yogi Berra's obituary change you in some way? how we can ask deeper questions. What might this illustration tell you about a character's feelings? That's a way to get a very young child to talk about text. Even the spot books or Biscuit has expression on their faces to ask them to tell us more. What might be making this character change her mind? What lesson could we learn from what happened in this story? And for informational text, what might be the purpose? Why do you think the writer wrote this? What kind of teaching was this writer doing? What text features helped you today? Like my nephew said to me, I like your tip about the bolded parts, he said at the end of our discussion on Google Docs. What words or phrases did the author use to try to persuade you to see her point of view? Informational text is never just about information. It almost always has something to do with the writer's point of view. I remember my father once showing me a headline of the Cleveland Indians playing against a New York team. And he said, if you look at my Cleveland paper, it's going to look a lot different than if you look at the New York paper tomorrow morning. That was my first experience with a reader showing me that writers are writing from points of view. You can do just what we did here tonight, this idea of turn and talk, with the simplest text. This book does not have many words in it. It has beautiful illustrations. What might this illustration tell us? How do the colors the illustrator uses indicate mood or theme? And I'm asking very young children these questions. So those books that you revisit, your question about how do I get my daughter to continue reading aloud with us, is to say, let's revisit some of our favorite texts. Let's go back and ask deeper wonderings. What's a hunch you can make about this text that we can begin to seek some evidence for? My hunch is this little boy, he's a little confused about moving, said one of my students to me the other day. I said, let's read together and find out if our hunch is right or not, or if we can even prove it, yes or no. The dialogue that we create through the reading or the storytelling we do off the books we read, whether they're graphic novels or the picture books, tried and true, or joke books, is what we can do to make those stories our own. Whether it's retelling family stories, oh, we read this book called City Secrets by Naomi Nye. And in that book, this little girl lives across the world from her grandmother. And her Palestinian grandmother and her back in Texas have communication and only see each other once every many years. And so my daughters and my nephews, we talk and we tell family stories off distance and separation. And family stories my grandparents told me. We use artifacts to inspire stories of family experience. We read a book called The Chalk Doll by Charlotte Pomerantz. And then instead of closing the book and going away from it, we say, let's talk about the dolls and the artifacts that I had from my own childhood. Telling our stories, the traditions behind family names. Recording our relatives, telling their own stories, and playing them again and again. Using really, really, really great online resources back to the video. Let's empower the video. Let's make the video part of our children's reading lives using really amazing apps that are, by the way, all free. Adobe Reader, VoiceThread, StoryCorps. Put these on your children's devices. Let them read, write, storytell off the stories they read before bedtime and in the mornings on a Saturday morning. There's a really great app called Chatterpix Kids, and it's one thing you look at when you go home. This is the most hilarious. And my students use it to take pictures of themselves, and then they cut out the mouths, and they record themselves reading aloud from picture books, and then they take them home to read to their younger siblings. And you can do those things at home, having your young children read aloud through Chatterpix Kids, where it makes them look funny and breaks through the hard part of feeling like maybe this book is a little bit too hard for me. It makes it all so silly and so fun and so funny. So I'm going to end with one final note, and then I'll open it back up for one last little round of questions, because I know we have to end in just a few minutes. And that is, I said, read. Ritual, environment, access, and dialogue. And I said I'd give you one more. And that is what that writer is going to tell you in the Sunday New York Times Magazine this weekend, is that her kids can't see her read. On the phone, it's much harder to see. When my kids were growing up, they're older now, so they could see me carrying that People magazine around. They could see me opening that recipe book and cooking from Mark Bittman. They could see me reading that novel, not once, but twice. Maybe not even twice, but 3 times. We have to show our kids that we love something about reading, even if we don't. We have to find something to love. We have to be authentic and generous in learning to love it. And if reading feels hard, like it does for every one of us, we also have to be very public about that. Reading felt hard for me today. I did not understand what my boss was telling me. He wrote me an email and it made me confused. And I had to reread that email over and over. I didn't understand it. My daughter asked me, how do you break through from that? And I tell her, rereading really helps me. And I stop and think that I bet everybody is trying their best. And if I look at that reading through that lens, then I can say that that person on the other end of the email might have been just trying their best. And I can read it through a different lens. And that's how I approach my reading today. How about you? Was there something difficult in your reading today? You can ask your children when they come home from school, what was a breakthrough you had as a reader today? Or what did you feel struggle felt like to you today? What would it take for us to overcome that together? And that, at the end of the day, that's the love of your child. That love is so triumphant. It's so profound. It's the thing that makes me reach for Charlotte's hand, although she's 21 years old. It's the thing that made that man on the plane open his eye and reach for West, who was literally levitating on the airplane. That's the love that makes us really raise lifelong readers. It doesn't have to be, I love to read Anna Karenina. It has to be, I love you, I embrace our struggle, and I'm accompanying you on this journey. So with that, let's take one last turn to turn and talk. Find one other person you haven't talked to yet. Do one more turn and talk. Let's have maybe one more quick round of comments, and then we'll draw to a close in about 5 minutes. It's such an act of love to come out on a Friday night to talk about reading. And so that in and of itself is an act of love for the profession of teaching, for the teachers who are here, and for the parents who are here as well. It's such a real, I really pay so much tribute to each of you for your dedication to your children. Is there any final wondering or two that I can help you with while I'm here with you?
You have many good suggestions. Can we get the copy of your slides?
Yes, of course. I'll share that with the team here in Acton.
We'll post them.
Thank you.
We'll post it.
Yeah, I was going to mention about how these are bilingual or trilingual and also literacy about their children, reading in other languages as well. And a lot of these ideas go to translate there, but there may be other things that come into the context or the
it's interesting. The question is about children of speaking different languages or learning to read in different languages. And I've traveled all over the world, and my organization is called Lit World, and so I do advocacy work in every part of the world. And it's very interesting to me because these methods, this whole concept of building and creating the reading environment, it works everywhere in every language. And I think maybe in terms of, for myself, actually it's kind of a funny story, but with my work, I carry books with me wherever I go because the United States is actually so innovative in children's literature beyond, really, it's amazing. In many countries, there is no form of children's literature yet exactly the way the United States values it so much. So I really advocate for local languages to create their own children's literature, and countries like Haiti are doing that now, and Liberia, Kenya is doing it, but it's a newer genre. But it's funny because, like I said, people will say to me sometimes, well, you carry these books, but they're not culturally relevant, and I say to them, but the truth is children love children's books, no matter where you go. Like Clifford, the big red dog, I've never seen a big red dog in any country. You know what I mean? So it's really like, I don't know what you mean by that. Children can transcend everything to get to this point that I make about the humanity of reading. And language is so complex. Of course, we have languages that are, there. I work a lot in Kenya, and there are many, many mother tongues there. So even though Swahili is the most commonly spoken language there, English is the language in the schools. If you go out into the rural areas, you'll find multiple languages. But the beauty of it is there is language structure everywhere, and children are very adaptable, and their muscles and their brains are extremely adaptive. And so they can do a lot more code switching than we can. And so we are very still, we're like, do it this way or that way, and children can do so much more. Their brains are still so much more flexible. So not to be afraid. Also I encourage teachers to make sure that wherever possible you have language, books that represent the child's home languages available to them and abundant to them. Let's take one more question and then we'll close. Well, thank you all so much. Oh, I'll give you my contact information as well. Oh, I always put this at the end of when I'm talking to parents, because this is the book I remember the most vividly that my mother read to me. And I remember there's a part of this book where little Sal is going around, and then there's a bear cub, and it's coming the other direction. And the mother is collecting blueberries, and Sal is like trailing behind her. And the mother is, the sound of the blueberries going into the pail is kerplink, kerplank, kerplunk. And my mother's voice is so vivid in my mind. It's such an important part of myself as an adult reader. So when you think that you can do that, you can put your voice into someone's heart for literally the rest of their life, that is such an enormous, profound power. So even when they are going into uncharted territory, you know that they will be carried forward by your voice. So here's my contact information. And I invite you to be in touch. I love social media, and it is a blended world after all. And so thank you for being here tonight. It's great.